Hey guys, today I want to talk for just a few minutes about the French Indian War. Now, this war is also called the Seven Years' War. We're going to refer to it as the French Indian War because I really like it when we call things names that help us remember what it is. Now, you just have to remember that it's not implying that the French are going to fight Indians. This is going to be a war with the British and the colonists in America fighting the French and Native Americans. Now, some Native Americans will be on the side of the British, but they will, by and large, when they take a side with France. Now, there are going to be three major causes of the French Indian War. So, the first one, we're talking about disputed territory. All right, so in North America, we're going to have Spain, France and Britain are primarily the landholders here. And there's this area right in here called the Ohio River Valley. Now, there is some other disputed territory. If you're looking at the map, any of this kind of interspersed territory is disputed territory, but the biggest one is the Ohio River Valley. And France and Britain are both going to lay claim to that area. Um, River valleys are really, really fertile. You can grow lots of stuff in them, so everybody kind of wants it. All right, so we're fighting about territory. There's also going to be some issues with Native American relations. So we talked about how the French were more colonizing for the fur trade. You're going to have fewer people. Now, you will have some large colonial settlements amongst the French. Usually, they'll be a little bit more clustered together than the British are going to be. But by and large, they do have better relationships with Native Americans than, say, the British, who had a tendency to just kind of kick Native Americans off their land. Um, then we're also going to have some issues with the fur and the beaver trade. So I told you guys before, that's really what France came over doing. And remember, Britain came over a little bit later. They started colonizing later on. And so they're getting into the game. They're trying to start trading with Native Americans, but they have worse relationships. And this area in the Ohio River Valley is a really good area for that trade. And so all of that is going to end up in this big war that's going to be fought between France and Britain, with Native Americans mostly siding with France and with the colonists obviously siding with the British. The end of the war is going to lead to tensions between the colonists and the British. Right? That's really, really important. That's honestly the most important thing for you to remember about the French Indian War, because this is happening just prior to the American Revolution. These tensions are going to spark some of the problems that we see before the American Revolution. All right, so first let's check in with Native Americans, see what's going on with them prior to the French Indian War. Now, they are fighting wars of their own. Specifically, they're going to be fighting Morning Wars and Beaver Wars. And what we're going to see is these are going to turn into a cycle. So, morning wars are fought to replenish the dead. Morning wars had actually been fought even before European contact, when a Native American group would have something devastating happen to them, like a disease or a famine or another war. They would fight a morning war where they would bring new members into their tribe. So they're replacing their dead. A lot of the time, the new members would even take on the names of the dead. Then you've also got beaver wars, and these are what they sound like. They're going to grow from the need for beaver pelts to obtain more guns for morning wars. All right, so let me explain a little bit. Um, in Europe at this time, beaver pelts, beaver hats especially, are all the rage. Right, so everybody wants themselves a beaver hat, but also furs of any kind. Because remember, we said that the beaver and the fur trade is a major cause of the French Indian War. And so instead of colonists, whether those are British colonists or French colonists, instead of them going out and trapping animals, skinning them, and then trading the furs to Europe, instead they're trading with Native Americans to get these furs. And so what'll happen is a lot of the time the beaver pelts are going to be traded for guns. As you have more and more guns come into play within Native America, within all of these different groups who are fighting each other in morning wars, as you have more guns, war becomes more deadly. So, in order for you to win your morning war, you have to get more guns. How do you get more guns? You trade more beaver pelts. If you don't have more beaver pelts, the way that you get more beaver pelts is by fighting a beaver war. I know that logic all sounds really circular, and there's a reason for that. It's because it is circular. It's because it's a cycle. So you'll start out right about here. You're going to lose members because of war, disease, famine, whatever. You're going to lose some members. And so you're going to fight a mourning war because you need to replenish your dead. So notice mourning, like if you're in mourning, you mourn somebody, right? Because you're mourning the dead. So we're fighting a morning war to replenish our dead. But then when we're fighting that morning war, we're going to realize that we need more guns. Otherwise, we're not going to win our morning war. And so we end up fighting. We have to fight a beaver war because that's how you get more beaver pelts. You trade them for guns so that you can win your morning war. But then all that happens is you end up accidentally starting the cycle again because you fought another war. You fought a beaver war, so you've lost members. And you just have to go and fight another morning war again. So, in addition to conflict within Native America with the Morning and the Beaver Wars that are impacted by Europeans, we're also going to see conflict with colonists. Now, there are a ton of different conflicts that we're going to see. I want to talk about two of them that happen kind of close to Georgia. These are really, really interesting to me. So we're going to talk about these, but I want you guys to understand these are not the only conflicts that are happening. Tensions are really high between colonists, whether those are French or British colonists, and Native Americans at this point in time. All right, so this is going to happen in the Carolinas, both of these. So you've got the Tuscarora War first. In the Tuscarora War, the Tuscarora people start their war because the colonists are encroaching on their land, but also because they're being kidnapped into slavery. Now, Native Americans don't make good slaves in North America because they know the land very well and because they can usually run back, if not to their own tribe, to another tribe that will take them in. It's one of the reasons that African chattel slaves become so much more popular than Native American slaves. But that doesn't mean that we can't send Native Americans somewhere else and make them into slaves there. And that's what's going to be really popular at this point in time. You'll uh, kidnap Native Americans into slavery and send them somewhere like the Caribbean. All right, so the Tuscarora are fighting against the colonists in Carolina. There's another group, though, the Yamasee, and the Yamasee are going to help the colonists. All right, one thing that you really need to understand is we have a tendency to look at Native Americans as just Native Americans. We don't see them as people from different tribes with different heritages, with different loyalties, and different um, hostilities as well, different issues that they have with various other tribes. We tend to think of them all lumped into one, but they weren't and they're not. And so what you're going to see is the Yamasee don't necessarily like the Tuscarora that much, and they are going to join with the colonists. And so eventually the Tuscarora kind of give up. Instead of being taken completely out, though, they are actually going to go northward and they are going to join with the Iroquois Confederacy. So the Iroquois Confederacy originally was 5 major tribes. Now we're going to make it into 6. And everything seems good for a little while, but then we're going to get the Yamasee War. So, can you guess what the colonists do once they can no longer take the Tuscarora hostage and sell them into slavery? They turn on their allies. They're going to turn on the Yamasee and they're going to start selling them as slaves. Now, this is a huge war. The colonists are nearly defeated. Ultimately, what ends up happening, though, is the Yamasee are going to fracture. The Yamasee, as well as some of the Creek, are going to fracture. The Creek are going to come and try to help the Yamasee. They're going to break apart. And you remember when we talked about the Yamacraw? Those were the ones that were led by Tomochichi when Georgia became a thing. Well, these guys are going to come from the Creek and the Yamasee who leave their respective tribes because they don't like the way they deal with the end of the Yamasee War. All right, so now we got to fight. Now, we're not going to see just an immediate declaration of war. That usually doesn't happen. Usually, you have a lot of lead up to war because nobody necessarily wants to fight. And so, what we're going to see is in that Ohio River Valley in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, both France and Britain are going to claim land. Specifically, the colony of Virginia is going to claim some. And our good friend, George Washington, who later on is going to be president of the United States, but we don't know that yet. George Washington is going to be sent as the head of the militia to Western Pennsylvania to build a road with the intention of claiming that land. So Washington is going to more or less just tell the French to leave. The French are going to be like, ha ha ha, no, we won't. That's a terrible French accent, and I'm sorry that I did that. But so they're basically just gonna be like, y'all go home. And the French are like, nah, no, thank you. We're not gonna do that. And so instead, what ends up happening is Washington is going to capture a French scouting party. After he does that, he has a Native American ally named Tanagrisson. Tanagrisson is going to kill the French ambassador that they capture. And that is when things start to go down. Because once you kill somebody, you can't really go back from that. The French are angry, the colonists are angry, everything is just insane. And Washington is going to end up building Fort Necessity. So he's trying to build this road. He ends up building Fort Necessity, honestly, because it's necessary for him to build it, because otherwise he's going to get his butt kicked. Ultimately, though, the French forces are going to capture him and they send him home embarrassed. And that is the Battle of Jumonville Glen. Now, the Battle of Jumonville Glen is not necessarily the beginning of the French Indian War. It's just an eruption of tension. And so it becomes clear to pretty much everybody involved that war is coming. So, what do we do when we know that there's going to be a war? We have a meeting. All right, that's just kind of what we're going to do all throughout the revolutionary period. We realize something terrible is going to happen, so we have a meeting. And then a lot of the time, we're going to write something in the meeting. That's how we deal with things. All right, so we're going to hold the Albany Congress in 1754. This is going to be a meeting of 7 out of the 13 colonies, some British representatives, and Native leaders. And the original intention is to improve Native American relations and gain the loyalty of the Iroquois. But one of the major things that we're going to see come out of it is they start to advocate for a union between the British colonies for security and defense. Now, this is not a cry for independence, all right? Not at all. I don't know what happened with my E there. All right. Not a cry for independence. It is very, very different. We're trying to forge some sort of union, basically, so we can present a unified front so that we can have one body in the colonies making decisions and advocating for the colonies as a group to the British government. So this plan this union is called the Albany Plan of Union, and it's presented by our good friend over here, Ben Franklin, who looks absolutely done with everybody in literally every portrait that is ever made of him. All right, so Ben Franklin is going to propose this loose confederation of the colonies who would have a limited authority to levy taxes to a central treasury and would kind of be an intermediary between the colonies and what they want, what they need, and the British. Ultimately, this is approved by the delegates, but Britain doesn't approve it, and the colonial assemblies don't approve it. So we are not actually going to have an Albany Plan of Union. Now, one thing that is going to come out of this, though, is the first political cartoon in the United States. So, our good friend from the last slide, Ben Franklin, is going to draw the Join or Die cartoon. All right, so like I said, this is a political cartoon. And the idea is to get people on board with the Albany Plan. All right, he is not advocating for independence. He is not advocating for us fighting with Great Britain. He is advocating a colonial union. Okay, so this colonial union is represented by this snake. Each of these pieces of the snake is supposed to represent a piece of the colonies. We are actually going to see it again later on in the revolution, but for now, it isn't particularly successful. All right, so we're not going to talk about a whole lot of battles in talking about the French Indian War. You guys are going to have a video to watch. And so usually, instead of me just talking about a bunch of battles to you, since we're not in person right now, I'll tell you guys a little bit about some really important battles and then we'll watch them. We'll watch documentaries or videos that are a little bit more interesting than just me talking at you. All right, so one of the important battles that we need to talk about, though, is the Battle of Monongahela. All right, so this guy looks like a grade A butthead, right? This guy is General Braddock. General Braddock is very confident in the way the British do things, in the British military, which, I mean, he should be because the British are pretty much the supreme military force in the world by this time. They're good at what they do. Um, so him and about 2,000 soldiers are going to be marching toward Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania. All right, so here's Fort Duquesne. And you can see this is all around that Ohio River Valley that I was telling you about. So this is where all that disputed land is happening. George Washington is actually going to be one of his aides de camp. When this battle starts, it begins as an ambush by the French and some of their Native American allies. When it happens, Washington is going to be like, hey, General Braddock, we should maybe not stand in straight lines and shoot back at the Native Americans who are popping out at us from behind trees. Because that's kind of what the British did at this point in time. Traditional warfare, you kind of stand there in your regiments and shoot at each other like civilized gentlemen. But that's not what the French and the Native Americans were doing. They were using more guerrilla tactics. And so it's really not working against the French and the natives. Braddock himself has 5 horses shot from under him. I don't know if you can imagine that in your head. Like you're sitting there on your horsey and directing your men, and all of a sudden an arrow comes, hits your horse, the horse dies. You're like, bring me another horse. And you do this 5 times without changing your strategy. That is how committed to the way he did things General Braddock was, even against the advice of George Washington and the other colonial militia. Um, this attitude is pretty prevalent amongst the British regulars, and that's going to be a source of contention and a source of tensions later on between the colonists and the British. So, for example, let's look at what George Washington wrote after this battle. All right, so he says here, this is a letter to his mother. We marched on to that place without any considerable loss, having only now and then a straggler picked up by the Indian scouts of the French. When we came there, we were attacked by a body of French and Indians whose number, I am certain, did not exceed 300 men. So, not that many guys. Ours consisted of about 1,300 well armed troops, chiefly of the English soldiers, who were struck with such a panic that they behaved with more cowardice than it is possible to conceive. All right, so Washington is telling us about the panic and the cowardice of the British regulars. He's also telling us that they vastly outnumbered the French and the native scouts. He tells us the British troops showed a good deal of bravery and were near all killed, for I believe out of 3 companies that were there are scarce 30 men left alive. The general was wounded, of which he died 3 days after. So, you guys, General Braddock literally died of his douchebaggery. All right, he refused to change his tactics and he died because of it. He says, I luckily escaped without a wound, though I had 4 bullets through my coat and horses shot under me. Captain Zorman Morris, 2 of the general's aides de camp, were wounded early in the engagement, which rendered the duty hard upon me, as I was the only person then left to distribute the general's orders, which I was scarcely able to do, as I was not half recovered from a violent illness that confined me to my bed and a wagon for above 10 days. So, we know that Washington had been sick before this battle. We also know, though, that he's writing to his mommy, so he's probably milking it a little bit. But we can take this with, even if we have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because he's probably exaggerating a bit, we can say that these numbers are probably fairly accurate. We do know that General Braddock died 3 days after, and so we can generally say that he's more or less telling the truth. He says, I'm still in a weak and feeble condition, which induces me to halt here 2 or 3 days in hopes of recovering a little strength to enable me to proceed homeward, from whence I fear I shall not be able to stir till towards September, so that I shall not have the pleasure of seeing you till then, unless it be in Fairfax. All right, so George Washington is obviously not terribly happy with the performance of the British, talking about their cowardice and their panic, and his perception is kind of mirrored by a lot of the other colonial militia. All right, so just to give you an idea of what these guys would have looked like, we have our British redcoats here. We also have the colonial blue coats. We have the French white coats, and can you guess what we called the Native Americans? These guys are our no coats. So we're going to skip over some of the fighting, some of the particulars of the French Indian War that, like I said, you guys will see in the video. Um, and I want to talk about a guy named William Pitt. So, William Pitt is actually going to become Prime Minister of Britain, and he basically wants to win the war no matter what. So, what he's going to do is he's going to have a strategy where he puts Britain super, super deeply into debt. He basically throws all of their money, all of their resources, all of their people into winning this war. And his strategy is overwhelming the French. And it does work. The last major battle is going to be the Battle of Quebec, and the French are going to surrender a year later with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Now, it is important for you to remember this 1763 because apparently Paris is a really good place to make treaties. So there's another one when we end the American Revolution, and even later on with the Spanish American War, there's going to be a Treaty of Paris. So we've got the Treaty of Paris, we've got the end of the French Indian War. But couple things. First thing, we do not consult a particular group. We don't consult the Native Americans. They're not heard in the Treaty of Paris. That's going to be really important in just a minute. We also are going to give a bunch of land. The French will give a bunch of land to the colonies, to the British. So all of that Ohio River Valley, that is now technically going to belong to the British, but the colonies are going to see it as theirs. All right, there's some other stuff, there's some other concessions, things like that in the Treaty of Paris, but those are the really big things that we need to remember. So when we get all that land from the Treaty of Paris, very quickly, the British are going to realize that Native Americans don't particularly like us, and that is a problem. And so we're going to see the Proclamation Line of 1763 be drafted. So this declares that American colonists would not be allowed to set up or keep settlements west of an imaginary line running down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. If you look at the map, the Appalachian Mountains are going to make settlement in that Ohio River Valley and a lot of that disputed territory that we just gained. It's going to make settling there impossible. And so the colonists are going to be pretty angry because, after all, what did they fight for if they're not going to get that land at the end? We're also going to have some anger from Native American groups. Um, and as a result, we're going to see Pontiac's War. This ends up being the largest Indian war in American history. Again, this is something that you guys are going to watch in a video. Um, but Native Americans, like I said, aren't included in the Treaty of Paris, in those treaty negotiations. As a result, there are going to be some changes in diplomacy in the way that the British consult with and talk to Native Americans. It's also going to be a huge threat to their autonomy. Now we're kind of kicking the French out of a bunch of land, and Native Americans relied on both the French and the British being there so that they could kind of play them off of one another. Um, Pontiac's War is going to try to unite all Indians in Michigan. They're going to come together. They're going to attack Fort Detroit. And it's only going to end after the Treaty of Paris is actually signed and everything's over and done with. And again, like I said, you're going to be watching a video that has some of the battles from the French Indian War, as well as some on Pontiac's War. It'll give you some more information. All right, I will see you guys next time when we start talking about revolutionary America.